labor VOODOO. My name is Lucia, and this is the tale of how my mother's ambition condemned us to a dreadful fate. It all began in our small fishing village in Veracruz, where my mother Rosa and I sold chicken fish at the local market. It was a challenging business as the competition was fierce, especially with Miss Ola, the neighboring seller. She had a loyal clientele and better quality products. I must admit with some embarrassment that my mother was not very diligent and did not pay as much attention to the cleanliness of the stall as my sister and I did. Whenever we could, we both pursued a career, and we rarely had the chance to go to the stall. Whenever we did, my mother complained about the neighbor, saying she sold more and always had more customers. Although both stalls were full of products, the customers seemed to prefer Miss Ola for her cleanliness and service. This deeply angered my mother, and she couldn't stand watching people walk past our stand to go directly to her one day during the peak tourist season. The tension between them reached its boiling point. A regular customer of my mother decided to buy from Mrs. Ola. That was the final straw. My mother approached the stand, and after an exchange of words, a heated argument began. "You're always stealing my customers," shouted my mother with her face red with anger. "It's not my fault they prefer quality," Ola replied without backing down, holding a knife in hand. The shouts attracted a crowd of onlookers, and soon insults turned into shoving. Within minutes, the situation spiraled out of control. Both women started destroying each other's stands, with chickens, vegetables, and various products flying through the air, creating chaos in the market. The screams and sounds of objects breaking echoed everywhere. After the altercation, both women were left with a deep-seated animosity. Deep inside the commercial realm, my mother couldn't bear the thought of being referred to in such a way, even if it meant selling at the market. It was then that she sought out Mrs. Gata, a market herbalist known for her mysterious practices and knowledge of voodoo, an inheritance from her African ancestors. The herb seller, upon hearing my mother's desires, not only taught her the voodoo methods to get rid of her rival, Mrs. Ola, but also practically didn't charge her anything. Now it happened that on a rainy night, while the lightning illuminated the sky and the sea roared furiously, my mother arrived at Mrs. Kata's house, a gloomy place filled with magical items and various relics from her African religion. Mrs. Kata gave my mother a doll made of rags and straw, saying it represented Mrs. Ola. She explained that for the doll to have power, Something personal from the victim had to be added. Hair, blood, or saliva. With cunning, my mother stole a lock of hair from her rival. Halfway through attending to the customers, she asked to have a word with her to make amends, to which the lady did not object. But my mother achieved her goal. She held a lock of hair and proceeded to tie it to the doll. That same night, with a lit black candle and the image of an unfamiliar saint, we watched from a corner as my mother began a ritual. Under the guidance of Doña Cata, reciting incantations, while she pricked the doll with needles, focusing all her hatred and desire to eliminate her rival. The atmosphere in our house that night was heavy and gloomy. The small room where we lived was illuminated solely by a black candle, whose flame flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and at times it seemed to gleam like eyes staring at us intently. My sister and I were absorbed in my mother's madness, and could do nothing to stop her. She was resolute, and we had to obey her. She scolded us whenever we disobeyed. The air in the house smelled burnt herbs and melting wax, a scent that mingled. In the dim light of the incense that Doña Cata had lit to cleanse the space, she suddenly fell into a trance of unsettling gestures that made us shiver in multiple ways. My mother knelt in front of an impromptu table made of an old wooden box on which the rag doll was placed. Doña Cata, wrapped in a dark shawl, observed intently, murmuring words in a dialect barely understood. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if something invisible yet powerful was taking shape around us. It was more than evident that both women had brought something. Madness settled upon all of us who witnessed these unexplainable events. With trembling but resolute hands, my mother took a lock of hair and tied it around the doll's neck. Doña Cata instructed her to draw a cross of ash on the object's forehead, which, according to her, would seal the bond between the object and the person it represented. Presented now. Repeat after me, commanded Lady Cata with her voice sounding almost hypnotic. My mother began reciting the words, a litany of curses and wishes of pain. Each phrase was a sharp knife aimed at the heart of Lady Pola. Meanwhile, my mother repeated the incantations, took a long needle, and pierced the doll. First the arms, then the legs, and finally the chest where the heart was located. May your pain be her pain. May her life wither like this flame, exclaimed my mother with a trembling voice as she extinguished the candle with a blow. At that moment, silence fell upon the room like a shadow. Lady Cata rose slowly and nodded, satisfied with the completion of the ritual. It is done. Now, you must wait and watch as her life begins to crumble, she said with an enigmatic smile. However, days passed and Lady Paula's health deteriorated, as reported by her assistant and niece, who was a friend of both my sister and mine. It was strange how everything began, with persistent head pains and sudden dizziness. These symptoms then turned into high fevers and seizures. Doctors couldn't find an explanation for her illness, and Paula was rapidly losing strength. Each day, her energy faded away more. Almost corpse-like hue. Meanwhile, something peculiar started happening in our house. Dark shadows moved in the corners, and the atmosphere became increasingly heavy and stifling. I would wake up in the middle of the night with terrible nightmares, feeling a malevolent presence constantly watching over my sister Yami. Windows would on their own, letting in a chilling wind that made the walls tremble. Food would spoil without any apparent reason. And the worst part was that all our pets were dying from unknown ailments. One night, I was startled awake by a strange sound. I got up and saw my mother sitting at the kitchen table, murmuring words while holding the Bud doll. I don't know where she got it from, but that item was supposedly buried after the gruesome process at Mrs. Cat's house. The black candle from that ritual was still burning on the table, and she had also hidden it with the rag and straw doll, either in the middle of the table, surrounded by a circle of salt. Mrs. Cat had warned my mother that the voodoo was not something to be taken lightly. The power she had invoked came with a price, and if she wasn't willing to pay it, the consequences were dire. However, my mother, blinded by her ambition, ignored the warnings. The price, as I understood it, was the lives of those she loved. First it was our dogs, but since we had no more animals, it was left to us, and my mother knew it perfectly. As Paula's health deteriorated, she talked more with her niece. Gradually, they noticed shadows becoming more aggressive as they began to take on ill-defined forms and moved throughout the house, taking advantage of the dim light. They moved swiftly from one side to another, sometimes even seeming to try to touch the walls. The walls creaked and groaned, and we heard voices calling us from everywhere and nowhere. I gazed at ghostly figures in the mirrors, figures that vanished as soon as I looked directly at them. It was madness that gradually undermined our understanding, plunging us into a whirlpool of terror that we couldn't control with anything. We were cursed, and up to that moment, my mother didn't understand that her daughters had also been harmed in the same way, almost like a twist of fate. Paula died one stormy night. Her death was swift and brutal, her screams echoing throughout the town as her body convulsed one last time before becoming lifeless. The news of her passing spread rapidly, and although many mourned her departure, my mother couldn't hide her satisfaction at seeing Paula's empty stall at the market. That was the only thing that interested her, and she had finally accomplished her goal. Without protection one night, while trying to sleep, I felt a chilly hand touching my shoulder. I quickly turned and saw a shadowy figure without a face leaning over me, looking at me with eyes filled with violence. I felt a great fear of dying. That's what that thing was conveying to me. screamed and my sister ran to my side, but the figure had already vanished. My mother's illness progressed rapidly. Her final days were an indescribable agony. What began as mere headaches and fever soon turned into something much more sinister. Her skin became foul, smelling, her eyes sunken and dull. She spent nights writhing in bed, muttering incoherent words and screaming amid terrifying hallucinations. Every night, she was tormented by visions of a figure whose empty eyes stared at her as her body decayed. Sometimes, she would wake up covered in cold sweat, claiming she had felt invisible hands choking her. Other times, she rose from the bed and dashed through the house, trying to flee from dark figures that only she could see. Her delirium grew more intense with each passing day, and nothing we did seemed to alleviate her suffering. The shadows in our home became more aggressive, moving swiftly and lurking in every corner. One night, she saw one of those shadows materialize in front of my mother's bed. The tall, faceless, dark figure leaned over her, whispering in an unknown language. My mother let out a scream that alerted us as the shadow vanished into the incense smoke. That was one of the last times I heard my mother's voice. One day, she simply succumbed and died, losing the battle against the illness. Her body convulsed one last time before becoming still. The house fell into a broken silence, only interrupted by the sobs of my sister and mine. Our mother's death left us not only orphaned, but also cursed by dark forces. That she had unleashed suffering did not end with her passing. Those spirits continued haunting you in the darkness and moving in the corners of the house. The nightmares were persistent, and both my sister and I would wake up in the middle of the night, terrified by the same visions that had tormented my mother. The nights were a torment, and fear prevented us from resting. Eventually, we decided we could not continue living in a cursed place. We ended our stay as best we could, sold everything we owned, and left for the city, hoping to leave behind the horrors we had experienced. We found jobs trying to build a new life far from the fishing village, and most importantly, far from the memories of the sorcery that had destroyed our mother. However, the memory of the sorcery and the horrors it unleashed never left us. Occasionally, the shadows and cursed voices return in our nightmares, constantly reminding us of what we have endured. Although we managed to flee from the village, and everything my mother did out of jealousy did not erase the emotional and spiritual scars of that curse. One that will haunt us for the rest of our lives.